Hello, I'm Josh Kolpak. I wanted to talk about the composer Maurice Ravel today, one of my absolute favorite composers, who's often put in the category of Impressionism, which does have some truth to it, but he is so much more in his compositional style. Now, if you saw the performance video I did, you may have heard a little bit about Impressionism, especially in reference to Claude Debussy. A composer who definitely does fit into that Impressionist mold. And again, Impressionism is a compositional style that others have found similarities to with the Impressionist art style of Claude Monet or Renoir are the two of the most famous examples. Some of those compositional styles which, again, take away some of the clear detail and kind of give you a broader picture of something maybe from nature, or water is often used with Impressionist composers as inspiration. And Ravel does have some of that, and he does write some very Impressionist pieces, like A Boat on the Ocean or Jet d'eau. But today I wanted to look more at his neoclassical compositional technique, which again still has some Impressionist characteristics, but very much reaches back to the past for inspiration as well. Now, Ravel lived from 1875 to 1937, obviously some very eventful years in history, and one of the pieces we'll look at today really draws on one of those important events. But the first piece I wanted to talk about was his Sonatina. Now, a sonatina is just a short sonata. So if you're familiar with the music of the classical period, which was the late 18th and early 19th century, music of Mozart and Beethoven in particular, you'd know that many piano sonatas were written back then because that was the most common way to write for solo piano. Now, sonatas were still written in Ravel's time, but composers reach into many other genres as well. So when Ravel writes a sonatina here, he is very much reaching back to some of the techniques of the classical composers. So the interesting thing is he's using modern harmony while also using some of the characteristics from earlier composers. That's why we call it a neoclassical style, using both modern and earlier techniques. So let's first look at how the beginning of this sonatina is structured. And even though it sounds very dense, it's actually quite simple in the way that he puts together the opening of this sonatina. Now, the way in which this sonatina begins is pretty simple. There are three main parts, or voices, that are put together. The highest and the lowest play the melody in unison. In between, there are continuously alternating notes that add harmony. Now, when you put it all together and you speed it up, you have the beginning of the sonatina. Now let's see and hear a recording of the beginning first movement of this sonatina, and see if you can hear that main theme, that main melody come back in different ways, and the way he kind of uses modern harmony in a neoclassical approach. Now the second piece I want to look at by Ravel is The Tomb of Couperin. Couperin was a French composer who lived 200 years before Ravel in the Baroque period, so even before the classical period. And again, we have a neoclassical approach by Ravel of using modern harmony while still reaching back to the past with different compositional techniques from the Baroque period. And one of the ways that Ravel reaches back to the past is the way that he sets up and structures this whole suite. A suite being different movements, short movements strung together. Now it starts with a prelude, which is what we're going to look at today, which is just a piece that opens a suite or a group of movements. And everything else would have also been common compositional movements from the Baroque period. So we have a fugue right after the prelude. There is a forlane, which is not as common now, but was common back then. A rigodon, a minuet, and a toccata. It ends with this virtuosic toccata, one of the actually most difficult things ever written for the piano, which is very common for Ravel to write very difficult pieces. But I want to focus on the prelude today, which is what I'm going to share with you. So let's first look at the way that he uses modern harmony at the beginning of this prelude. Now, one of the ways in which Impressionist composers created their sound was through the use of unique scales, such as the pentatonic scale, which has 5 pitches instead of the usual 7. So if I were to take a G major scale, which has the pitches G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G, with the G doubled on top, I can take away 2 of those notes, C and F sharp, and then I have a 5-note scale with the pitches G, A, B, D, E, G, with the G again doubled on top. Now Ravel uses that particular scale and creates a figure at the beginning of the prelude. The left hand immediately comes in with a different pentatonic scale centered around C. Put together, you have 2 different pentatonic scales alternating between one another. You also get a pentatonic scale at the end of the prelude with an E minor pentatonic scale sweeping from the lowest to the highest part of the piano. See if you can hear that at the end of the prelude. Now what's so interesting about this prelude is that you have the impressionist sound created by the pentatonic scale, but you also have the neoclassical approach that he gives to us with the use of many ornaments. Now ornaments are just little decorative figures that are used for melodic, rhythmic, or just ornamental purposes. They could be a turn, they could be a trill, or they could be a simple mordent, which is just 3 notes, or the reverse. Ravel uses the mordent all over the place in this piece. He uses it in a way that would have been much more common during the Baroque period. Ornaments were used in Ravel's time, but not nearly as much as he shows us during this prelude. Now, The Tomb of Couperin was written during the time of World War I, in fact in 1917, so in the midst of the war. And World War I affected Ravel greatly. He wanted to fight, but was deemed underweight, and ultimately he served as a supply driver throughout the war. And every movement, The Tomb of Couperin, is dedicated to someone he was connected to during the war. And later on, a different piece, his piano concerto for left hand, was written for a friend of his who was a pianist and actually lost his right hand during the war. So World War I greatly affected Ravel and those around him. Now, if you're interested in listening to more Ravel, I'll offer a few recommendations, maybe based on what aspect of his composing you like best. If you really like that impressionist type of composition, I would check out his suite Miroir. If you like that neoclassical style, I would listen to the rest of Tombeau de Couperin. And if you maybe want to hear the jazz influence he had later in his career, check out his two piano concertos. There's a lot of jazz elements in those pieces that you don't get as much with earlier Ravel. Thanks.